Hey YouTube, I'm Mr. Terry, a high school history teacher, and welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. Alright, today's video was chosen by our awesome patrons over at Patreon, and that is History Summarized Britain by Overly Sarcastic Productions. So it's been months since I checked out an Overly Sarcastic Productions video, and I've liked what I've seen so far. So I've seen you guys have been continuing to recommend them, and it's good to head back there. So I'm excited to check this out. Now this video just came out a little less than a week ago, and it's doing very well with views. So it looks like a lot of people are checking this out. But yeah, I'd love to learn more. We'll see what they got with Britain in a 12.5-minute video, what you can, I guess, cram into that. So I'm excited to check this out. All right, the original video link is down below. Make sure you click that to support them. Subscribe to Overly Sarcastic Productions. If you haven't yet, give the video a view, all that good stuff. Let's support these awesome content creators. All right, and with that, there's some links down below to some other things like my gaming channel, which I've been doing some more stuff on recently, and links to some other fun stuff as well. All right, let's go ahead and get to it.
British history is famously kind of impossible. The individual sagas of the Isles up to 1600 were already plenty complex on their own, but after England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland become a geopolitical megazord, those stories interlock, and then things get really tricky. But that's just the British part, because we also have the little subject of their empire. As the following 4 centuries see a globe-trotting whirlwind of exploration and colonization that culminates in the single most cartoonishly humongous empire in human history. So in a noble but fundamentally doomed attempt to recount the interwoven stories of Britain and her empire, oof.
Good luck.
Let's do some history.
Good luck, blue-eyed dude.
King James inherited the English crown in 1603.
Okay, wait. So we starting with the 1600s? You know, not talking about early Britain's Roman era, that stuff. I mean, that's fine. You gotta start where you can, but.
And luckily avoided being exploderized by the diabolical John Johnson and his fellow gunpowder junkies. Their plan was certainly extreme and their idiocy was correspondingly immense, but their religiously motivated discontent was broadly reflective of the public's mood.
What does it say? Me and the Catholic boys fighting for religious tolerance by blowing up Protestants. You know, Britain has had such a tug of war with kind of state religion and just religion in general, going back through the Reformation, as Protestantism in its various forms was creeping its way over into Britain, and then monarchs like Henry VIII trying to deal with that, and then later iterations is it kind of does this back and forth from Henry and then like Elizabeth and Mary and Edward and like all these people. So yeah, it was always this big like pendulum with a lot of violence involved as well.
Religiously motivated discontent was broadly reflective of the public's mood. The Protestant Reformation took various shapes across Europe, and this very recently...
King Henry of England is legally allowed to kill his wife or whatever. I honestly don't care. I'm German. It's supposed to be Martin Luther? Like, what? Posting this? In Britain, it's supposed to just be the 95 Theses? Had nothing to do with Henry. Nevertheless.
Albeit loosely unified, Britain was running the full spectrum. Ireland was still majority Catholic, Scotland was Presbyterian Protestant, and England was a right mix. The Anglican Church was firmly Protestant, but maintained...
We did tell the Pope to scram, but the power structures are pretty useful, so we kept those. It all just answers to the king now. Yeah, the creation of the Anglican Church, stemming from Henry VIII's kind of removing himself from the Catholic Church or taking the authority of the church away, is kind of the root of this. So as part of that process, the King of England was the head of the church.
Catholic-style ceremonies and administration. This sat poorly with England's Catholic and nonconformist Protestant minorities, as well as almost all Scots and Irish.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the creation of the Anglican Church, it doesn't appease anybody. It just divides. Like, no one's rooting for this that much, There's people with both sides, or different sides of kind of believing this, and they're already saying, talking about the religious diversity that's going on. But yeah, it doesn't... I don't know if anyone's really clamoring for it.
A century earlier, this wouldn't have been a problem, but now that Ireland, Scotland, and England were ruled by the same king, they needed to play nice. and none of them wanted to. Add to this tension that the king and parliament were now openly antagonistic, as in 1629 King Charles dismissed parliament entirely for 11 years, and when he begrudgingly brought them back to raise taxes to finance a war against Scottish Protestants, parliament allied with the Scots against the king, defeated him in war in 1646, and executed him on charges of treason in 49.
Rip.
Parliament then abolished the monarchy, and for the next decade they governed the Isles as a republic. Catholic Ireland disliked the fiercely Protestant English government, and the Scots were understanding.
I'll be honest, this period of the history of Britain is a weaker point for me. So this is really useful. Okay, like 16th century. Actually, not even 16th century, but more like 17th century, which they're doing now with the 1600s. So this is actually good timing for me to strengthen.
Upset to hear that the English Parliament had murdered their Scottish king. So another round of war ensued. Scotland was straightforwardly beaten into submission, but Ireland was devastated, with between 10 and 25% of the population killed and all but Connaught fully confiscated by England. And this was not the first such conquest, as King James sent British colonists to Northern Ireland to establish the Ulster plantations in 1609. By the late 1600s, Ireland was blatantly treated as a colony. Not Protestant, not Britain, very exploitable. Right. And we see that same logic applied to the Virginia colony in 1607 and other New World endeavors thereafter. Back in Britain, Lord Protector Cromwell died in 1658, and in his absence, the Republic started floundering. So here's a swerve for you. They asked the king to come back. In 1660, the Stuarts returned, but they wouldn't stay for long because King James II was super Catholic. So in 1688, Parliament swerved yet again by extending an invitation to the king's Anglican daughter Mary and her very Protestant husband Prince William of Orange to...
So again, you have this like these decades and decades of the pendulums swinging, you know, largely dependent on what the religious convictions of an English ruler are. And since basically the king, can make laws, you know, strictly about religious practice and things like that in Britain, that they wield such power, so they can again flip that pendulum so much. But it's pretty difficult to do when you keep going back and forth. And look what it's already doing to their empire, if you will. These isles, I mean, they're you know, religion is such a unifying thing, and having this much diversity now and in opinions in the British Isles, where you have like the Irish being Catholic and Presbyterianism in Scotland, and then you have this again pendulum going back between more favoritism towards Protestantism or Catholicism in kind of England itself, or trying to tote the line in between. Would be very chaotic, no doubt. All right, we got William of Orange.
Throw a coup. A coup is better than an outright civil war, but Scotland and Ireland did rebel in discontent, and England brought the hammer down hard. Meanwhile, in deposing and replacing a monarch, Parliament had all new leverage over the state, and essentially invented the concept of constitutional monarchy. The hefty political implications of that will unfold over the next few centuries, but an immediate consequence was Dutch boy William's hometown rivalry with France becoming England's business. And this geopolitical deja vu will define the long 18th century, as France and Britain compete in a second 100 Years' War, both in Europe and all across their brand new empires. Inspired by the maritime mastery of Spain and Portugal, Britain sailed across the Atlantic to snag some colonies.
It's the age of imperialism. I mean, of modern imperialism, where again Britain and France are trying to establish massive global empires on every continent
of their own, founding Virginia in 1607 and continuing with a flurry of expeditions from the Caribbean all the way up the Atlantic coast and around Hudson's
French will
Bay.
be along shortly.
In 1664, they captured the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, renamed it New York, and by the end of the century, Britain was running a solid operation. London and...
Yeah, the Dutch kind of colonization here in this part of North America didn't last that long. A lot of people in America don't know about kind of the Dutch time there, and like even that New York was a Dutch colony as New Amsterdam, and then gets renamed and toppled over. The Dutch basically get booted out. Then they have to focus on stuff a little more south in South America.
And West British ports were bustling with imported furs, tobacco, cotton, and sugar. Seeing the opportunity to literally grow money, Britain took a page out of Portugal's colonial playbook and began buying up vast amounts of Africans to work as slaves over in the New World. And
By this time, the Portuguese Empire dwindled. I mean, the Portuguese Empire was kicking butt globally in like the 1500s. But as Britain and France and the Dutch started to grow in power, the Portuguese felt the biggest effect of that as they lost a lot of their stuff. Now, the Portuguese were really focused on Southeast Asia. I mean, of course, you have Brazil and stuff like that, but the trading ports, right? And the trading areas, the Spice Islands around Indonesia. But they got booted out by bigger nations that were coming onto this imperial scene a little bit later, but with more strength.
This was the infamous triangle trade. British guns and textiles pay for slaves, who then staff increasingly massive plantations, and those crops sell in Europe for boatloads of money.
You probably, if you're an American in a U.S. history class or anyone in a world history class, you know about the triangular trade. You may have even done a diagram looking exactly like this, talking about where this stuff is going here. But again, this was the source of the wealth coming into Europe and what made places like Britain incredibly wealthy, because this was a process that largely benefited the British as a middleman, gaining the value that came from slaves, and then the production in the Americas as a result of slavery, with those funds intentionally being designed to benefit the British crown.
Rinse, repeat, buy more slaves. Africans were treated as little more than the raw
Do it for
materials
300
of
years.
empire, overworked, given nothing, and brutally abused. A fifth would die crossing the Atlantic, and the average life expectancy upon arrival was just 7 years. This was almost abhorrent enough to make people think twice before they remembered how obscenely
gonna be
rich
a while.
it was making them. Slaves made money, money made armies, armies made empire. Rinse, repeat, buy more slaves. In Britain, this cycle paid for improvements in government bureaucracy and overhauled all of finance with innovations like the central bank. And during the 1700s, these early successes just kept on compounding. 1702, France tries out for the Spanish crown, and Britain makes them pay for it with Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. Plus, they take Gibraltar from Spain, so now Britain decides who gets in and out of the Mediterranean. 1740, Britain dunks on the French Navy because they can. 1754, British and French colonists fight over who gets North America, and 2 years later, all of Europe is throwing hands at each other.
Yeah.
Britain
I've seen, if you've seen a lot of my videos, kind of differentiating the 7 Years' War and some of the conflicts within it. For the British perspective, this conflict in North America has been boiled down to being called the French and Indian War. The British were fighting against the French and their Native American allies for these territorial claims, especially kind of in the middle of America, around Ohio and things like that. But it was a part of the larger context of the 7 Years' War, like they're talking about now, which was a global war. So it's like you have these conflicts that kind of get their own, you talk about them separately, but are part of a global conflict, which is what the 7 Years' War is, which I've said kind of repeatedly, if you heard it in different channels, probably one of the most painfully underappreciated as far as effects go, wars in modern history. It's going to dictate a lot of history and start a big, huge chain of events and chain reaction from here, from the mid 1700s through, I mean, really the modern era.
Britain's massive pocketbooks let them throw in
And
money.
famously, a lot of people say maybe the 7 Years' War should be called the First World War, just because of its fighting on multiple continents.
The problem, so they take French Quebec and the Mississippi River Valley, push France out of India, and with this field to themselves, begin steamrolling all of India.
Yep, this is the high point for the British Empire. Once they boot out the French out of North America, largely out of North America, at least the parts of the British were most interested in, and then India, because India was more important really than North America when it came to colonial possession, as India was so incredibly wealthy when it came to resources and labor. That's the British. That was a bigger prize than North America. But you could see, I mean, this is kind of the end of the French Empire in a lot of ways when it comes to territory in direct conflict with the British. And these will have economic effects on the French. I mean, we're going to get the French Revolution here in a couple decades, and they're in deep economic problems.
push France out of India, and with this field to themselves, begin steamrolling all of India. The 7 Years' War doubled the size of the British Empire and knocked out every outside threat, so now they just needed to keep it together. And naturally they didn't. See, when the British imposed new taxes on stamps and tea to pay for the ludicrously expensive war they just fought, American colonists were furious to be treated like, gasp, a colony. So they started asking the philosophical questions at the heart of self-determination, such as, hey, King George, what's the opposite of tea? Yeet! Worse yet, France was egging them on, and then they got ideas.
Yeah.
Of course,
So this is, again, going back to that cause and effect we were talking about with the 7 Years' War. Even though the British won the 7 Years' War, it was so economically draining that they increased taxes on their colonies. And America was one of those places where they increased those taxes because they felt, hey, we fought for you guys against the French in basically your homeland, and you're part of our empire. You should be a part of that process. Right? Even though the tax rate for Americans was far lower than it was for actual British citizens in Britain itself, the Americans still didn't like that. That's where you get that term, no taxation without representation, which looks a lot better than saying, we just don't want to pay taxes, right? I mean, nobody loves paying taxes, but it sounds a lot better of an argument. We're like, no, we're actually not complaining about taxation and being taxed necessarily. It's the fact that you guys are making taxes without us having any representation in your government where those taxes are created, which sounds like a more legitimate argument, but let's just not forget. They just didn't want to pay more taxes.
Of course, the French Revolution is a philosophical and political doozy all on its own,
Sure.
but what matters for us is that France threw down the gauntlet with basically everyone and conquered nearly all of mainland Europe.
The revival of
Britain
the French
withstood a
Empire.
continental trade embargo and even blocked an attempted invasion, but their greatest weapon was Napoleon's own hubris, as his empire evaporated
True.
in 1815 and the Second
Overextended.
100 Years' War was firmly in the books. Point Britain. While the Empire was gearing up to become the master of the world, Britain still needed to be the master of itself, and that was a tricky prospect. After the Revolution of 1688, Catholic and pro-Stuart uprisings in Ireland and
I don't know
later in
much about this
Scotland threatened
conflict.
to untie the delicate knot that kept the kingdoms together. So England solved the issue by two means: legal mechanisms and violence. In 1707, England formally unified with Scotland to create the Kingdom of Great Britain, and again in 1800 to create the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. What was once a
won't
complex
last.
web of personal unions and technically independent states were now just the same kingdom. Nice and easy. This was enforced forcefully, as a slew of penal laws in Ireland systematically deprived Catholics of property, religious freedom, and political rights. These laws were
Not
repealed
smart,
in
right?
the late 1700s and early 1800s, but as we see with
Potato
the
famine.
unchecked devastation of the potato famine in the middle of the century, the government still didn't really care all that much. As is the case from earlier, Scotland got off quite a bit easier. Well, the agriculture of the Highlands was entirely overhauled, with mass evictions, the complete disassembling of the clan system, and a little titch of cultural erasure. The cities in the south had a grand old time, as Edinburgh was the brains of the empire, and Glasgow's ships were the heart of
Edinburgh.
Britain's maritime power. And speaking of power, the turn of the century brought the Industrial Revolution, which gave Britain the tools and the technologies to single-handedly dunk on the entire rest of the planet. The advent of mechanized industry and steam power changed the lives of everyday Britons by bringing them affordable consumer goods while cramming them into cities and, in the case of the poor, factories. But that in turn made Britain the manufacturer to the world and, increasingly, its owner. With cool new gizmos like steamships, Britain could hold a network of colonies no matter how far they were. To reach the vast riches of India, British sailors could pass along Sierra Leone, St. Helena, the Cape Colony, Mauritius,
build a
and the
canal.
Maldives. But by the end of the century, after the Suez Canal opened, you
There we
could
go.
pass Gibraltar, Malta, Cyprus, Egypt, Aden, and Somaliland, and then keep going past India to
Yeah, the Suez Canal was a breakthrough economically for the British because you had to go around Africa. And that could take months, and through the Suez Canal, you get to India in like 2 weeks on a fairly slow moving ship. So, yeah, it was a breakthrough that way.
Malaysia, Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand without once making port on a coast that didn't belong to Queen Victoria. In 1921, you could walk from South Africa to Mesopotamia and never leave British territory.
This was a DBQ on the AP World History Test once, where Britain had a plan to build a railroad completely through this territory in Africa from Egypt, and I guess they could have, maybe connected into Mesopotamia, but all the way down to Cape Town or any of these parts in South Africa. It never happened, but they were thinking about it. So it'd be like this trans-African railroad, which would have been pretty incredible. And that doesn't happen. There was a bunch of railroads built, but not one big connected one. But you could see how that would have been beneficial, and that's kind of what they wanted. Have all of Africa, like a whole corridor, a British corridor in Africa.
The raw scope and diversity of locales at play
Sun
here
never
is frankly
sets.
absurd, as it's dizzying to distinguish what's behind this blanket of red draped over a quarter of the world. And while that diversity found its way into Britain itself through communities and art and food from all over, it raises some rather thorny questions about belonging and ownership. There was a tangible dissonance between the idea of all these disparate cultures coming together and the reality of Britain sitting at the top. Still, disparate cultures coming together and the reality of
Tenny sitting atop the world being a tad overt there, lads.
Britain sitting at the top. Still, British and other European empires knew that outright colonization was not necessary to squeeze out wealth, and the prime example is China, which Britain ransacked in the Opium Wars
Not
to get
for
better
wealth?
trading rights and a tiny little island called Hong Kong. Because why bother colonizing all of China when you can just smack them into letting you trade whatever and wherever you want?
Well, sure. I mean, colonizing China is impossible anyways, so they had spheres of influence that almost acted like colonization, where they had exclusive rights and enforcement of their own laws in China. I mean, it's pretty close to colonization. It's not fully colonization, but yeah, I mean, they got the people addicted with opium, and then, it made it a lot easier to have that kind of influence.
Of course, keeping these far-flung territories safe from other prying empires produced a cycle of take it now so no one else can, leading the Europeans to carve up all of Africa in just 20 years. As we know, it wasn't long before they pointed those...
Everything except for Ethiopia retained its independence. You can say Liberia a little bit, but that was a protector of the United States. But yeah, basically every single part of Africa was colonized by a handful of nations, a good 6-7 nations or so, and that could have started a war. By the way, if they hadn't, or start a war with European nations amongst themselves. A lot of these African nations try to fight for their independence and fight against the colonization, but as you saw, they all failed militarily except for Ethiopia, who actually defeated the Italians. But the Europeans were able to avoid fighting each other over Africa with agreements they made at like the Berlin Conference in the 1880s, and kind of establishing rules for European colonization of Africa.
Carving knives at each other, and so the world wars happen. Yes, they're very important, we're not getting into it. What matters to Britain is that although it did win both wars, it lost heavily in that process. Despite scoring some prizes from the losing empires along the way, it became clear that these colonies, which fought so hard for the British cause and were sometimes in the theaters of war themselves, needed the big reward. Much of the British public was for this, as the wheels of national sovereignty had been turning since Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa became self-governing dominions around the turn of the century, and the Republic of Ireland gained independence in 1922. But after the Second World War, those ideas were finally trickling out to the other colonies. So over the next few decades, the empire dismantled itself.
Sure. The World Wars brought an end to that era of imperialism. We have a new economic form of imperialism, and maybe other forms that people would say of imperialism is going on, but World War II, whether you were on the winning side or losing side, was the death of that classical imperialism.
Mostly non-militarily, but very irresponsibly. As a rule, Britain didn't care where they drew the borders, nor how bad of a mess they left behind.
Yeah, the borders of these colonies were far more about trying to appease territorial claims amongst other European or powerful nations, rather than forming real ethnic borders based off of the cultures of the people that they rule. And the decolonization process, when these powerful nations are starting to leave their colonies, left these colonies in shambles, as the disunity naturally in those countries led itself to make it very difficult to form long-lasting stable governments and agreements on economic systems and things like that. And those are things that, of course, you can see the effects of those today all over the world. They basically said, okay, here was your country. We're not keeping you all together anymore, and we're not really leaving you with anything. See ya.
Exhibit A, India. This continued through the
Just split
1900s
it.
and culminated, somewhat tragically, with the handover of Hong Kong to China in 1997. Built from the ground up in the span of a century and a half, Hong Kong had an international identity and a true blend of cultures that, despite centuries of lofty ambitions, no other colony.
Look at that. That's just amazing. You got like the classic European architecture there, and then the new modern skyscrapers there. You know, Hong Kong in a kind of tug of war
had ever
cultures.
achieved. Far be it from me, of all people, to bemoan the death of the British Empire, but I will mourn Hong Kong. Meanwhile, in the closing hours of the century, the United Kingdom allowed Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland to form their own parliaments and govern themselves more directly. What that means for the future of Britain? We're not there yet. And that, is the history of the British Empire. What it all meant and what we should take away from it are the subjects of vigorous academic and public debate. I can go on and on from my comfy top-down perspective, but the consequences of this history play out in the lives of billions of people.
What does it say? To speak so top-down risks making the story as cold and analytical as a board game of one which astoundingly actually exists. Oh, really? The game of British Empire, or trading with the colonies. Each player starts with a cargo from London and has to deliver some or same and take up from the colonies what they export. There's a colonialism game. I mean, there's a lot of those, but like economic trading empire game.
It's constitutional government, industrialization, global networks, bitter post-colonial rivalries, treasures missing from their home cultures, and a very,
Benin,
very
African
contested
stuff.
picture of British identity. Who belongs? Who benefits? Even just inside of Britain, that is a lot to unpack. And with the topic as broad as the British Empire, there are no universal answers. What can I say? That's Empire for you.
Yeah.
Thank you for watching. This video was a long time coming, and I hope that I was able to do some justice to a subject as broad and complex as this.
You did. Awesome. All right, let's break this down a little bit. All right, so I can see why they kind of started here with kind of the 16th and 17th centuries, because wondering, you know, history of Britain, and they started in like in the 1600s, but it's really history summarized the British Empire as like an overseas global empire in that process. So it makes sense kind of with what they talked about. But like I said during the video, there was a bunch of time periods covered, especially in the time between like Henry VIII and really I guess through like Queen Mary and Edward through the 7 Years' War, where I had been a little hazy and got to see more of that, and you could see a lot of the conflicts, a lot of it dealing with Great Britain itself, right, with the issues that went around Wales and Ireland and Scotland there, and dealing with that and the continued tug of war back and forth. And then but that was good, though. That was good to be able to see that going down there. So anyway, great job by Mr. Blue Guy from Overly Sarcastic Productions. Good to get a little bit of history there. If you got any comments or anything down below, other things you think I ought to know, you can definitely put it down there in the comments. Check out the original video and make sure you give it a view and like and all that kind of stuff so you can appreciate them and get what they deserve. And with that, we'll see you next time. Bye.